Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I'm delighted with the turnout. Thank you for trudging through the snow. Oh, sorry, that's the January talk. Yeah. My name is Paul Saucon, and I'm the chairman of the Dean's Advisory Committee on Jewish Studies, at least as far as I remember. And I would, or as the French say, jusqu'à nouvel ordre. And I would like to welcome you here. I would like to first call upon the president of St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo, Dr. Michael Higgins, to welcome you.
It's always a great pleasure, indeed, to welcome all of you here. St. Jerome's University takes pride in being able to host this. We often do. We provide wonderful food, wonderful setting. It just flows beautifully into the evening, right up into the reception. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome you tonight because the topic seems so wonderfully provocative. Religion without dogma. Must a Jew believe anything? I can tell you this. If I change the topic to religion without dogma, must a Catholic believe anything? I would be applying for the position of Joseph and Wolf Lebovich, Chair of Jewish Studies. In other words, I would be nakedly unemployed. So I celebrate the opportunity for this lecture to be given in this hall. I look forward to the wonderful conversation and questions that will result from the presentation, as I'm sure it will be as wonderfully provocative as every other one that has preceded it. Welcome to St. Jerome's and Siegfried Hall.
Thank you, Dr. Higgins. I'd like to call to your attention a talk that we're going to be having on Monday, the 4th of November at 7:30 p.m. here at Siegfried Hall. The world's authority on the Cairo-Geniza project, which is now housed at the University of Waterloo, thanks to our Chair of Jewish Studies, Dr. Jim Diamond, is going to be coming from Cambridge, England to speak about the Cairo-Geniza project. And that is a must talk for anybody interested at all in Judaic studies and religious thought. So please make a mental note. Monday, the 4th of November, 7:30 p.m. here, we will have the world's expert on the Cairo-Geniza project talking about his work and about the direction of the project for the future now that it is housed at the University of Waterloo. It's now my pleasure to call on the Joseph and Wolf Lebovich Chair of Jewish Studies at the University of Waterloo, Dr. Jim Diamond, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Paul. It's very gratifying to see the crowd that turned out for a very, very exciting and interesting topic tonight. It is indeed my pleasure, and sometimes I say this pro forma, but today I really, really mean it, to introduce Professor Menachem Kellner. And Michael, you took the wind out of my sails because I was going to say that Michael has agreed to write the companion volume to this for Roman Catholicism, which will be basically a one-page book with nothing on it.
You could write the
right. Menachem Kellner is a very distinguished scholar of medieval Jewish thought, one of the most renowned scholars in the world today. He is the Sir Isaac and Lady Edith Wolfson Professor of Jewish Religious Thought at the University of Haifa, author of a number of books, dozens, literally dozens of scholarly articles. And what's more, what's really important, what's become important for me is that the topic that he's going to dwell on tonight is really a distillation of his scholarly studies on dogma in medieval Jewish thought, which most scholars could have just left to sort of antiquarian interests, but Menachem has always managed to bring the topic up to date and show its relevance to the problems we all face today. And the book that he's written, which is the subtext for our topic, our lecture tonight, is Must a Jew Believe in Anything? And I just want to say, Menachem, that I wish you would have written this book when I was growing up so I could have shown this to my parents. Anyways, without further ado, Professor Menachem Kellner on Is Religion Without Dogma Possible?
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here at Napoleon Bonaparte's favorite university. I wasn't sure if every visiting speaker said that or not, but I thought I'd give it a try. I want to thank Jim Diamond for that overly warm, I don't object at all, but overly warm introduction. I'd like to say a few words before I begin. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Higgins and Sir St. Jerome's College for the marvelous hospitality my wife and I just enjoyed in the very pleasant company over a delicious dinner. Don't worry, it was kosher. And I'd also like to, I just heard about the fact that the University of Waterloo has succeeded in bringing the Geniza project here. And I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the significance of that step, and I thought I would take a minute to say a word about it. The Cairo Geniza, as some of you know, is the repository, the single most important repository of manuscripts from a very important period in Jewish and not only Jewish history. It's a coup of monumental proportions to have brought that project to this university. And I think everybody who has been involved in that should really pat themselves very warmly on the back. And I think the University of Waterloo is going to find itself suddenly a kind of central stop on, I guess you could call it the Jewish studies circuit, because you have now brought to this university a project of importance, and the importance of which for the study of medieval Judaism and the study of medieval Arabic language and literature and the study of medieval Islam. The importance of this project will just continue to grow over the years, and I really want to congratulate all of you. I'm very, very impressed and very pleased that what is clearly such a warm and pleasant place has succeeded in bringing that important project here. I'd also like to thank Jim Diamond, who has written an extremely important book about Maimonides, a book which is going to shake up not so much what we know about what Maimonides said, but the way in which we read Maimonides, and the way in which all of us who work in the great eagle's thought will from now on have to do our work a little differently because of Jim Diamond's book. And I think that for me, it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to speak after being introduced by a man whose importance is already recognized and will only be recognized more in the future. I was asked to speak for no more than 16 hours, so I promise. We'll keep it to about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and I hope that there'll be questions. If there aren't questions, I'll continue speaking till there are questions. So. You're warned. I'm not going to try and summarize this book for you. That would be self-defeating. The whole idea is to get you to run out to your computers and order copies from Amazon. But I do want to talk about the kind of problematic that generated my writing it, and tell you a little bit about what I tried to do and why I at least think it's somewhat valuable or important. First, I should say. Anybody who buys this book gets two for the price of one, because there are really two books here. One is what I hope is an interesting and in a scholarly, responsible fashion study of the nature of religious belief in Judaism. And the second book, which is shorter than the first, is an attempt to show that if I'm right in the first part, then the way in which Jews treat each other, in theological terms, is radically misconceived, or at least can be conducted in a much better fashion. I'll explain both these things as we go along. But I really wrote the book because I've got a problem, and I'm going to spend a fair bit of time explaining the problem. It's a problem I think that a lot of religious people have, and I hope that I can make you share my discomfort and then help perhaps some of you work through ways of solving that discomfort. And I'll be working with, of course, texts and traditions of Judaism, but a lot of what I have to say, I think, will make sense for people who come from other religious traditions as well. I want to start with the notion of monotheism as it's understood in the three Western monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The belief in one God, as these three faiths understand it, that which they share in common, which is a great deal. You know, if a person came from Mars, they'd have a hard time distinguishing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam because there's so much shared. I think a Buddhist probably has a hard time distinguishing the three faiths. That's not to say there aren't extremely important differences, but the differences are very apparent to the people who are involved. From the outside, there's a lot that's shared in common. One of the things that's shared in common is the notion that if there is one God, then what follows from that belief is some kind of universalistic consequence. After all, one God created the entire United Federation of Planets. And if that's the case, then it doesn't matter if you're born on Earth or on Klingon or on the Romulan home planet, or if you're green, white, or blue, or if you are tall or short, male or female, you all were created by this one God. And this universalistic thrust is very clear in all three of the traditions. The opening of the Hebrew Bible is that God, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. That's the entire heaven and the entire earth. And the first Jew doesn't show up until 20 generations into the story. The Jewish people don't become the Jewish people until halfway through the book of Exodus. The entire book of Genesis and much of Exodus is not a story. It gets more and more focused on the Jews as it goes along, but it's a story about God's relationship to humanity. So there's a tremendous, you might say, universalistic thrust that grows out of monotheism. But what I've given you with the one hand, I would take away with the other hand, because in the same sense that monotheism leads us to a kind of universalistic stance, it can and historically has led to an extremely exclusivist stance. Because if there is only one God, then perhaps there's only one right way to worship that God. And if there's only one right way to worship that God, only one right way to understand that God, only one right way to relate to that God, then anyone who doesn't worship, understand, or relate in the correct fashion is in an important sense outside, beyond the pale, out of the club. It's, according to some religious traditions, eternally damned. You know, there are tremendous consequences that follow from this exclusivist function or consequence of monotheism. So whereas you can take out of the belief in one God, depending on how you read it and where you take it, an emphasis on universalism, you can also take out of it an emphasis on intolerance. And I regret to say that historically it seems to me that most people have preferred the latter over the former. I'm editorializing when I say regrettably. But I feel confident that not too many people will disagree with me in this audience. That's one kind of problem that people in today's world face when they seek to be faithful to monotheistic religious traditions in the West. A second problem comes out of the notion of revelation. Revelation in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, at least as these religions were traditionally understood, is not some kind of, I guess I would say, namby-pamby inspiration. Revelation is not the kind of thing that Shakespeare enjoyed when he wrote his greatest poetry or his greatest poems, or that Michelangelo enjoyed when he created the Pietà or painted the Sistine Chapel. Revelation in the historical traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is an event. It's an event that happened, and it's an event which teaches truth. Now here too, there are two kinds of consequences. If you understand Revelation as teaching truth, you are led perhaps to a kind of universalism, because this truth is true for everybody. And my students will always, say things like, it's true for me. And I keep saying, I would give Maimonides a stomachache. If it's true, it's true. If it's false, it's false. We don't necessarily agree about it, but don't tell me it's true for you. So one possible consequence of the Western religious notion of revelation is a sense of universalism. We all should share in this truth. But unfortunately, just like the notion of monotheism, it can lead to exclusivism. Since there is one revelation which teaches truth, all competing revelations teach falsehood. And not only does this consequence follow vis-a-vis other religious traditions, within each religious tradition, you have people who say, well, my understanding of our revelation is the only correct, the only orthodox understanding of revelation. And everybody who understands it in a slightly different fashion from me is guilty of heresy. What I'm going to be basically arguing as I get along, I keep giving you coming attractions, is I'm going to try and end up with a Judaism which holds on to monotheism and to revelation but gives up on heresy. That's the goal I'm aiming at. Okay, now what I've sketched out till this point is very troubling for anyone who wants to live in the culture in which we find ourselves, a culture which used to say that Enlightenment values were a good thing. I'm going to continue saying that. I strongly believe I'm a classic Jeffersonian Democrat. I used to teach at the University of Virginia. How can I not be a Jeffersonian? We're surrounded by people who, I don't mean to step on anybody's toes too hard, but we're surrounded by people who think that notions, the Enlightenment values and the ideals associated with it are figments of Western hegemony. I can't even pronounce the word. I hate it so much. Hegemony. Whenever I hear that word, I say, uh-oh, I don't agree with what's coming next. They are just expressions of Western hegemony over other cultures. I'm not going to get into my standard tirades against all that, but if we accept the value of Enlightenment culture, if we accept the value of Enlightenment ideals, which for our purposes can be said to boil down to one very important one. Kant called it autonomy, you can call it self-fulfillment or self-realization, but I would prefer to call it self-determination. If we see that as a very important value in our lives, then we are led to understand that the religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have a hard time coming to grips with that, as I've described them in terms of monotheism and in terms of revelation. Let me tell you a story which well illustrates this problem. By the way, this is my personal record. This is the longest I've ever spoken at a lecture without telling a joke. I don't know, I'm in a serious mood tonight for some reason, which is like, I barely recognize myself, but I'll get back into my normal as we move along. Anyway, after spending dinner with Dr. Higgins, I'm afraid to tell any jokes because can't imagine topping him. In any event, there's a wonderful story about the German playwright Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who was the close friend of Moses Mendelssohn, who might be called the first Enlightenment Jewish figure. And it's not a story, it's something Lessing wrote, actually. Lessing wrote as follows: "Were God to offer me the truth on one hand, and the eternal search after the truth on the other hand, I would choose the search." Now let's think about that for a moment. That statement of Lessing's is pregnant with many important meanings. He's saying that what is important is not that I reach the truth, but that I seek to reach the truth. It's not the product that's important, it's the process. Now, I think that Lessing is giving expression here to what became a very prominent aspect of our culture. It's more important to come to understand things by ourselves than to understand them properly. It's more important to focus on the reaching for, the striving for, than on the achievement. Now, if Lessing had said this to any medieval thinker, be it Maimonides, the Jew, Aquinas, the Christian, or Averroes, the Muslim, they would have laughed him out of the room. What they were interested in was the truth. And if God had offered them the truth, they would have accepted it very gratefully. And they saw no particular value in the individuals searching for that truth. Since God was not going to offer it, then the search had value, because the search was the route to achieving that truth. But if you could get it, if it could be given to you as a present, then I'm not sure most of these medievals would have seen much value in the process itself. I realize that's a debatable point, and anyone who wants to debate it afterwards is invited to do so. But I think it's a legitimate interpretation of these three thinkers. So that a lot of what we take for granted as part of the baggage of our culture is something which doesn't sit well with the Western monotheistic faiths, which are, after all, trying to give the truth. Judaism doesn't come to teach opinions, it comes to teach the truth about God and the world. The message of the Gospels is not nice ideas, it's the truth. The Quran doesn't embody Mohammed's musings, it embodies God's truth, Allah's truth. So that when we come to look at these traditions with the eyes of people who've assimilated Enlightenment ideals, we immediately, I guess we get into some kind of cognitive dissonance, if that's the right word, some kind of internal conflict. Now, this becomes even more emphatic if we follow the route of many contemporary thinkers in our culture and adopt what I get multiculturalism not as a description but as a norm. If we say that all systems of values are culture dependent, which is certainly true, but are also, there's no way of judging between them. Once we go that route, then we've thrown out basically the entire tradition of Western monotheism, because no matter how liberal you get within Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, I can't see someone within those traditions, saying that all traditions are equally false, which is basically what the multiculturalist claim boils down to. And it also boils down to a further consequence, namely that all moral positions are relative. You cannot, to my mind at least, be a consistent multiculturalist without ending up in some kind of moral relativism. After all, let me give you an example of what I mean, why I find it so offensive. I live in Haifa, teach at the University of Haifa. About 2 kilometers down the road from my university is a spectacular monastery called Muhraka, on the spot where Elijah is said to have had his conflict with the prophets of Baal. And about 3 kilometers further down the road is a village called Daliat al-Carmel, which is one of the Druze villages on the Carmel mountain range. About 3 years ago, a woman who had grown up there and had left the village, gone to Europe, and for 20 years been a prostitute, came back to the village. And according to the news accounts, I mean, I wasn't there, so I can't really, this is not firsthand, but according to the news accounts, the entire village came out to the village square and stoned her to death. This was 5 kilometers from my office 3 or 4 years ago. Now, I strongly feel that I can't say, well, they have their system of values, and that's fine, for them. It's not fine for them. It's not fine for anybody. I'm just telling you this to express, to give you a vignette of how strongly I feel that moral relativism is not the route to go. It gives you no way of condemning vile behavior on the part of people who are only living out the values of their culture. But that's more an aside because it bothers me than for anything else. Okay, so I've sketched out what I take to be a serious problem, not just for me and not just for Jews, but for anybody who wants to take seriously the teachings of their religious tradition and also live in the modern world. Now, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have all, actually that's not true. Judaism and Christianity in the West have been forced to confront this clash with Enlightenment values, and these religious traditions have come up with a million different ways of accommodating themselves or the culture of the West so that they can live in it. And there are just endless varieties. The standard statement, 2 Jews, 3 views. That's probably too modest, 2 Jews, 12 views or something. But one of the reasons this is the case is because Judaism has had to confront, the story of this Jewish fellow who was Jewish fellow. That's such a classic Gentile way of saying. This Jew was on a ship that sunk, and he's the only person to survive, and he's on a desert island for years and years and years, and finally another ship comes by, and the captain comes down, and the Jew is showing him around what he's done on the island. And the captain says, wait, you've built 2 synagogues here. I know you know this joke, but maybe not everybody has heard it. The Jews have all heard it, I know, but this is a joke for the Gentiles. So the captain says, you've been here alone for 30 years. Why'd you build 2 synagogues? And the Jew says, well, that's where I pray. I wouldn't be caught dead stepping into that place. Now, any Jew in this audience who hasn't heard that joke should check their Jewish credentials. I don't know, there's a rabbi in the world who hasn't used it at least 30 times in his or her career. But that's a function of what I'm talking about. Judaism has splintered because it has bumped into the Enlightenment in a very hard fashion. Even beyond the split between Orthodoxy and Western Christianity and between Catholicism and Protestantism, one of the, I think, reasons why there's such a plethora of ways of being Christian in the modern world is because Christianity also bumped into this and has sought to modify itself. I think Islam is now, for the first time, being forced to bump into this hard. It'll be interesting to see what happens in another 50 or 100 years in that context as well. Not that I expect to see it, but it'll be interesting for somebody. A future speaker in Siegfried Hall will perhaps talk about that. Now, against that background, I want to, and that's all just like introductory stuff to set the stage. Against that background, I want to go from the general to the more particular and talk about the way in which these issues sort of find expression in contemporary Judaism. And in order to do that, I want to talk at some little length about the notion of religious faith in Judaism. I better keep track of the time, otherwise I'll go on forever and ever and ever. The point I want to make is easily stated, but not so easily understood. At least I found that to be the case, which probably means I haven't stated it clearly enough, but I'll try to do a better job tonight. What does it mean to say of a person that he or she is a religious believer? And many of us will immediately answer, let's rephrase that. Let's say you're walking down Bathurst Avenue in Toronto, in the Orthodox areas. I realize that Bathurst is divided into Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconformadox. Every 2 blocks is a different kind of... I always tell people Toronto is the city with the world's longest and narrowest Jewish community. In any event, if you stopped a fairly literate Jew on the street and said, what does it mean to be a Jewish believer? Most of them would answer, it means accepting Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith. Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith is a text written in the 12th century by perhaps the single most influential Jew who ever lived after the first Moses, as an individual, I mean. There are other important Jews, but Maimonides' imprint is actually, his personal imprint is found in almost every aspect of subsequent Judaism. Maimonides maintained that for a person to be considered Jewish, to be considered a good Jew, to be considered at all Jewish, they have to accept as true 13 discrete statements, God's existence, God's unity, God's incorporeality, all the way down the line to the 13th is belief in resurrection of the dead. About which there's a lot of debate whether Maimonides believed in resurrection of the dead. That's a separate issue altogether, but he maintains that Jews have to accept that. So if you were to ask a fairly literate Jew on the Bathurst Avenue, what does it mean to be a believing Jew? I think they would probably answer you in those terms. If you were to ask the first Moses or one of the rabbis of the Talmud, who created the Judaism as we know it, what does it mean to be a believing Jew? I don't think they would understand that answer. And that's basically the point I want to try to expand upon and illustrate this evening. And perhaps a good way of getting into it is by looking at the famous verse from the prophet Habakkuk, Tzadik be'emunato yichyeh. The righteous shall live in consequence of or according to her faith. I took a liberty there with the gender. The righteous shall live because of or in consequence of her faith. Now, there are 3 words there that need to be explained. Tzaddik, righteous. Yichyeh, will live. Be'emunato, in or through his faith. And I want to make the claim that what the prophet probably had in mind is that a person is defined as a tzaddik in terms of their faith, their emunah, and if they are a tzaddik, a righteous person, because of their faith, then they will live in the world to come. That's, I think, a fairly standard way of interpreting those 3 Hebrew words. But then we ask ourselves, well, what is it? Then the question, if indeed I'm right in interpreting the verse in that fashion, and if what stands in the balance here is life from the world to come, it becomes very important to understand what is the nature of this faith, which is so important to make a person into a tzaddik, into a righteous person. I'm going to give away part of the show right away. The Hebrew word tzaddik, ordinarily translated as righteous person, Can anyone help me? How would you ordinarily describe or define a tzaddik in Jewish contexts? Anybody want to? Well, I see we're not going to play that kind of game here. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Exactly. Someone who does the right thing. The classic Jewish definition of a righteous person is someone who behaves righteously. Now, if that's the classic Jewish definition and you're 100% right, then what does it mean to say the righteous person is defined by faith? How does that figure in here? And what I'm going to argue is that in classic Jewish texts, up until the Middle Ages, the faith which defined righteousness had nothing to do with theology. Certainly nothing to do with dogma, and I'll explain what these words mean in a moment. That's the sum total of what I'm trying to sell you this evening. If I'm right about this, then at the end I'll explain to you this as some very important consequences for the way in which Orthodox Judaism today relates to non-Orthodox Judaism. It also helps us to understand important distinctions between Judaism on the one hand and especially most versions of Christianity on the other hand. It also points perhaps in a direction which will enable us to solve some of the problems I started out with. Okay, so what am I trying to argue? It's actually not much of an argument. On the way up here, Jim Diamond drove my wife and I from Montreal, and we were arguing over how much prices in Israel have jumped. And I said, what's the point of arguing about this? It's a fact, we'll check it out. But so I'm not about to make an argument, I'm about to state a fact. The word for faith in Hebrew is Emunah. The root is Aleph Mem Nun. These are the Aleph Mem Nun for those of you who know it. The publisher told me that they put the mem over here on the spine for Menachem, my first name. Anyway, that root occurs, I don't remember, I used to know by heart, many hundreds of times in the Hebrew Bible. Now, when you go home tonight, before you go to bed, before you flick on the TV to check CNN or whatever, but check Fox, they're better on the Middle East. Pull out your concordance and flip through each place where the root Aleph Mem Nun occurs in the Hebrew Bible. And what you will find is that in almost every single occurrence, the meaning of the term in its context has nothing to do with correct understanding of theological claims. It has to do with trust and trustworthiness. Let me remind you of the first time that the term appears in the Bible. Abraham is an old man. Sarah, his wife, is an old man. This reminds me, my late father-in-law once was taking a flight with my sweet mother-in-law, and as they were boarding, and he was a man who was like 5 years older than his wife, he wanted to board early, so he said to the gate attendant, "She's a senior citizen." So Abraham, I'm sure, thought that Sarah was really old, okay? And they've had no children. So God says to Abraham, "Come out of the tent. Look in the sky, and what do you see?" And Abraham says, "I see fire-retardant ceiling tiles." And God says, "No, step all the way outside." "And what do you see?" And Abraham says, "I see stars." And God says, "Count them, Abraham." And Abraham says, "I cannot count them. They are beyond counting." And God says, "As the stars are beyond counting, so shall your descendants be." Now, the next verse is very interesting. It says of Abraham, "V'he'emin b'Hashem v'yachshevehu litzdaka." And Abraham he'emin, that's a version of the word for faith in God, and this was accounted to him as an act of righteousness. It's perhaps the best way to translate it. Now, what does it mean that Abraham he'emin in God, believed in God? Could it possibly mean that Abraham agreed to the statements God exists, God is one, God is incorporeal? And what kind of nonsense is that? Abraham was just talking to God. He has to now start believing in God's existence? It makes no sense whatsoever. What the verse clearly means is that Abraham trusted in God. And that's what was accounted to him as an act of righteousness. And so through every place where you find this term used in the Hebrew Bible, and almost without exception, even the exceptions you can see are ambiguous, but there are very few exceptions. I'll give you another example. Some of you know that upon rising Traditional Jews recite the following short prayer: Modani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam, al shechzarta li et nishmati, rabba emunatecha. Never mind, but it's basically a little prayer that says, I thank you, God, for having returned my soul to my body. And the last two words are rabba emunatecha, which means your emunah is very great. Now, if emunah means faith in the classic theological sense, what are we saying? That God is orthodox? Obviously makes no sense. But in the context, we're thanking God for having once again allowed us to wake up. In other words, God has once again proven to be trustworthy. In effect, when you go to sleep, you're handing your soul to God. Who knows if you're going to wake up? Who knows what's going to happen? You wake up and find, and you thank God for having once again allowed you to wake up in the morning. So clearly what's going on here has nothing to do with what you believe. It has to do a lot with your relationship to God. Now, if we were to examine the way in which this term is used, not only in the Hebrew Bible, but also in rabbinic literature, we would find the same kind of thing. A really good example of that has to do with the rabbinic take on the verse from Habakkuk that I began with. That verse is cited in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a very large body of literature, precisely once, in the following context. The Talmud says that a rabbi named Rabbi Simlai, claimed that there are 613 commandments in the Torah, and there's this whole long discussion. Just as an aside, here, I'm in a parenthesis, okay? This is the origin of the idea that Judaism has 613 commandments. And it's clearly a Stramonic idea. And he divides it up into 365 and 246. It says 365 is according to the numbers of the days of the solar year, and 246 is according to the number of limbs, according to the biology that was then understood in the human body, so that the 365 negative commandments, 246 positive commandments, every day you can fulfill God's wishes. With every limb in your body you can fulfill God's commandments. It's clearly Stramonic. I don't believe Rabbi Simlai intended for Jews from then on to say there are precisely 613 commandments. After all, depending on how you count them, either a lot less or a lot more, if you go into all the details. In any event, so this text in the Talmud carries on, and it says, well, no, that's what Rabbi Simlai says, and there's a verse brought to prove it, and then the text continues and says, but David reduced them, I think, to 11, and it cites a chapter from Psalms in which 11 different motifs are found. Then it says, but Isaiah reduced them to 6, and it goes on to 6, 3, 3, 1, and 1, and then finally it says, no, but the real truth is that Habakkuk reduced all these commandments to one, Sadiq be'emunato yicheh, the righteous shall live in or by or through his faith. Now, we start this paragraph with 613 discrete commandments. We end this paragraph, this is Talmudic sing-song, right? We end this paragraph with Emunah. So Emunah is something which is expressed how? You tell me, because you said it before. Through behavior, exactly. We're reducing the entire panoply of commandments to Emunah. So Emunah must clearly be something which finds expression in behavior. Now we're going to stop for a second and do a little bit of ordinary language analysis in English, but it also works in Hebrew. I can use the word believe in English in at least two very different ways. I can say that I believe that something is the case, or I can say I believe in something. And I'm going to make the argument that this usage reflects a distinction with a difference. It's not just two different prepositions. And I use myself as a guinea pig. For much of my life, I was grossly overweight, as round as I am tall. Maybe not that bad, but very, 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 very fat. And you could have asked me while I was stuffing my face with all kinds of unhealthy foods, Kellner, do you not believe that what you're doing is irresponsible and that you are being unfair to your wife and children, to yourself and to the healthcare system, and that you're going to end your life early because of this? And I could have said, I believe that that's true. Would anybody have considered me a liar? We all are familiar with cases where you believe that something is the case and you can't get yourself to live according to it, right? I'm sure there is somebody in this room who, God forbid, once smoked. I wouldn't accuse anybody of smoking now, but there may have been people who once smoked in the past. And I've known smokers to be puffing on unfiltered Camel cigarettes while admitting how dangerous and disgusting and foul and offensive and unfair it was. I would never think of them as liars. They're like really weak. I think of my case as like endearing human frailness. But no one would accuse them of lying, right? But let's say we take a person who proclaims her belief in democracy. And then we discover that she sends weekly or monthly contributions to skinheads here and the Ku Klux Klan there, and I don't know any I'm sure there are no Canadian anti-democratic movements, so I can't give any examples. And we find that she's extremely authoritarian in her relationships, and that on and on and on and on. She acts in a way which is clearly not what we expect of a person who professes belief in democracy. What do we say about her? Say she's lying. When we talk about belief in something, we expect the person's behavior to be consistent with what they profess to believe in. When we say that people believe that something is the case, we can understand why behavior might be inconsistent with it. So you say in English, believe in, believe that. In Hebrew, you say ma'amin bi, ma'amin she. It's the same distinction. The same distinction also obtains in other languages, and it also obtains importantly in Arabic and in Greek. Itikad in Arabic can mean belief in or belief that. It mostly means belief that, but it can also mean belief in. Pistis in Greek, I don't know much Greek, but I'm told that this is the case, can mean both, although mostly it means believe that. Again, a parenthetical remark. One of the important ways in which Judaism and Christianity misunderstand each other is that Judaism grows out of Hebrew, Christianity grows largely out of Greek, and where very often you think that the Greek is translating a Hebrew term, it comes with, like any other language, a whole baggage of meaning and connotation which is foreign to the baggage that the Hebrew term carries with it. For those of you who are familiar, just think of the differences between rachamim in Hebrew with its connotations of a mother's womb and mercy in Western languages. But the examples are legion. In any event, end of that wildly irrelevant parenthetical comment. It's an interesting lecture, but it's another lecture. But the way in which the Septuagint, the early Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, subtly changed the meanings of the Hebrew terms that were translated into Greek. Anyway, back to my point. If we start out with 613 commandments and end up with Emunah, what kind of Emunah are we end up with? Belief in or belief that? If you've been following, you should all say belief in. I don't hear it. Okay, that's clearly what's going on here. We're connecting behavior to belief. The belief we're talking about is what we've been calling belief in, not what I've been calling belief that. Now, belief that is defined in terms of specific statements. I believe that A is true, B is true, C is true, D is true. Belief in cannot be described in that fashion. Now, obviously, if I believe in my wife, I have to affirm that she exists, right? So it's not as if there's no connection. I'm dealing here more with a matter of emphasis than a matter of absolute hard and fast distinctions. Now, my basic point is that classical Judaism, as it finds expression in the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic texts, is a religion based upon belief understood as trust, trustworthiness, as a religion in which belief finds expression in action, must find expression in action. And that helps us to understand something. You can read through the entire Hebrew Bible and not find a single attempt at expressing clearly and systematically a theology. Theology comes from the two words theos, God, and logos, rational or disciplined speech. Theology is rational or disciplined, or what we call today academic speech about God. Systematic theology is an attempt to take this speech and organize it in a system, in a fashion which hangs together internally and which makes sense when you look at it from the outside. You can go through the entire Hebrew Bible and not find a single clear-cut theological statement. I know you'll say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." But even there's no attempt to understand what this means, and it doesn't even say you have to believe it. It's just a fact. Listen, God is one. I mean, how many, there are a gazillion thou shalts and thou shalt nots in the Hebrew Bibles. How many verses begin like this? Thou shalt verily believe that. Cursed be he or she who holds that. You're not going to find it. You can go through the entire rabbinic literature and at best find one possible counterexample to the following claim. There are no attempts to present a systematic theology, even an unsystematic theology of Judaism in the entire body of rabbinic literature. Now, if that's true, how much more so is it the case that you're not going to find dogma? Dogma, I'm always tempted to say dogma is a female canine with puppies, but my wife doesn't let me use that joke, so I just told you I would have used it if she hadn't been sitting here. I guess the classic way of understanding the term dogma, certainly in the West, is as a belief which bears the authority of religious, some kind of ecclesiastical body or authority. A belief acceptance of which is both a necessary and sufficient condition for membership in whatever religious tradition you're talking about, and a belief acceptance of which is both a necessary and sufficient condition for achieving a share in the world to come, getting to paradise, however you want to describe the next stage. That's like a very technical definition of dogma. Up until the Middle Ages, you will not find any attempts in the entire body of the Jewish tradition, and that's a very large body of literature, to specify the dogmas of Judaism. And I think the reason you won't find it is because in order to have dogma, you have to antecedently have a clear-cut theology. Dogma is a distillation of theology. If you don't have the clear-cut theology, how can you have the dogma? And if I'm right that classical Judaism is uninterested in theological issues, then of course there's not going to be any dogma. Now here's the point where I want to make myself very, very clear. I am not saying that the authors of the Hebrew Bible or the rabbis in the Talmud were uninterested in theological matters. I'm not saying that anything goes. I'm not saying they were laissez-faire theologians who would accept anything that came across their radar screens. I'm not saying that if a convert appeared before a rabbinic court in ancient Judea and said, I want to join the Jewish people, I want to join the Jewish religion, I believe in da-da-da-da-da, I believe that God gave the Torah at Sinai, I believe that Moses was God's agent in delivering the Torah to Sinai, I believe the whole panoply of things, and I believe that God is a pink elephant. I'm not saying that they would accept this person as a convert. Nor am I saying that if a person was a faithful participant in synagogue services, say in the 2nd century in the land of Israel, I almost said Palestine, but that's too politically heavy these days. If a person were a faithful participant in synagogue services, observed the Sabbath, kept the rules of kosher food, did everything possible, but had strange views about God, I'm not saying, and announced them, I'm not saying that that would go without comment. What I am saying is that whereas the rabbinic leaders of this person's community would be very interested if whether or not this guy came to the synagogue every Sabbath, whether or not this guy kept kosher, whether or not this guy observed the laws of family purity, and they would check perhaps, or if you were clearly not doing this, they would be upset and take some measure to change it. It would never occur to them to ask him about his theology. Now, this is a function of a number of things. It's a function, first of all, the fact that their notion of belief doesn't distill itself into theological statements. It's also a function of the fact that Judaism is not only a religion, it's also the way of life of a constituted ethnic group. Now, if you're a faith like Christianity, you can't be born a Christian, right? There's no such thing. You have to become a Christian. You have to accept, you have to do something, you have to believe in something, you have to learn the catechism. I mean, every Christianity has its own way, but there's no such thing as being born a Christian in the way in which you can be born a Jew. Because being a Jew is not just being a member of a religion, it's also being a member of an ethnic group. So for the rabbis, the Jews were a body of people constituted as much by ethnicity as by religion. So that's a second reason why they were less interested in theology. They weren't interested in defining who is a Jew. Who is a Jew is clear. He's part of the Jewish community. She's part of the Jewish community. Her parents were upstanding members of the Jewish community. There was no need to ask detailed theological questions. It just would never have come up. So I've given you two reasons to think that classical Judaism had no need for this kind of move. Now, what happened in the Middle Ages? Wait a second, before I go on. Best way to summarize what I'm saying to this point is a joke I read in a review of this book by Hillel Hulkin in the Jewish Forward. He says his father used to like to tell him the following story. There was a synagogue on the Lower East Side of New York. That's a city south of the border, which has a very large Jewish population. And the synagogue had a hard time attracting a minyan. It's not like Siegfried Hall and Waterloo University where there's no problem every year. A minyan is a quorum necessary for communal prayer. And so they sent out one of the functionaries to round, there were 9 people there, they sent out one of the synagogue functionaries to round up a 10th guy. And this is a deep, strongly Jewish neighborhood, so he stops a man on the street and says, "Pardon me, mister, would you join us for the evening service?" So the guy says, "I'm sorry, I can't help you, I'm an atheist." And the man says, first I'll tell it in Jewish and I'll translate it in English. He says, "Where is it written that an atheist doesn't have to daven Ma'ariv? Where is it written that an atheist doesn't have to say the prayer?" Now this joke, I mean, anybody halfway literate in Judaism immediately, resonates. It makes sense. Yeah, I mean, who cares what you believe? You still have the obligation. But think of it. It's like what you were saying before about Dr. Higgins, right? Think of a Catholic saying, "Oh yeah, I'm a very good Catholic. I'm just an atheist." It doesn't fly. So that joke really summarizes what I'm trying to say. What happened? In the Middle Ages, for a large number of reasons, which mercifully for you I don't have the time to go into tonight, a man like Moses Maimonides found it necessary to maintain that Judaism did have dogmas. Now, I simply want to say parenthetically, I think he found it necessary both for historical reasons and because he was an almost Orthodox Aristotelian. It had nothing to do with mimicking Judaism, Islam or Christianity. It had a lot to do with his being influenced by an Aristotelian model of human perfection. If you don't believe me, read my book, but that's not for tonight either. That was just also, I should have said it over here, that was a parenthetical remark. So Maimonides felt the need for a variety of reasons to claim that Judaism was a religion constituted by dogma. Let me just briefly read a text to you, because you wouldn't believe me if I didn't read it out of his actual words. After he lists his 13 principles of faith, Maimonides makes the following statement. When all these foundations are perfectly understood and believed in by a person, he enters the community of Israel. And one is obligated to love and pity him and to act towards him in all the ways in which the Creator has commanded that one should act toward his brother with love and fraternity. What makes a Jew, according to Maimonides? How do you get into the community of Israel? You accept these 13 principles. He says nothing here about Jewish mothers, about conversion. It's pure theology. This is all very complicated. I'm not saying that he's rejecting standard halakha, but he's certainly making a move here which is, in Jewish terms, unusual. Now comes the even more amazing part. Even were he to commit every possible transgression, it's the Day of Atonement, and while eating a cheeseburger, he shoots his mother-in-law, and all in one act. Even were he to commit every possible transgression, Maimonides says. I always have to say, by the way, that my mother-in-law really is a very sweet lady. It's just a cute, a trope in North American culture. Because of lust and because of being overpowered by the evil inclination, he will be punished according to his rebelliousness, but he has a portion of the world to come. He is one of the sinners of Israel. He remains of Israel. In other words, Maimonides here is making a sharp divide between theology, which is absolutely necessary, and fulfillment of the mitzvot, which isn't what's the word I want? The opposite of necessary. It's not optional, but it's also something that you can forgive. What he's basically saying is if your theology is straight, you can you can fail to fulfill all the 613 commandments, and yet you still are a good Jew. If I didn't know better, I'd say that St. Paul wrote this, not that Maimonides wrote it. But again, I want to emphasize that what's going on here is Aristotle, not Pauline Christianity as I understand it. But that's just an apologetic comment. It's neither here nor there. And I'm not going to get into the reasons why he did this, but I hope I've made it clear that he did do it. Now, there's a consequence of this. And the consequence is that Maimonides has introduced into Jewish discourse for the first time two terms which became increasingly important. And these terms are orthodox and heretic. And they're parallel terms. You can't have heresy without orthodoxy, and once you have orthodoxy, you have the possibility of heresy. And that's, to my mind, an absolute novum, an unprecedented change in Judaism. And it went largely unremarked and went largely unnoticed in the Jewish tradition, and was Maimonides' whole project found expression in hymns, but not in theological works. Can I take another 5 minutes? Sure? Okay. His project found expression in hymns, and that's an interesting point. Some of the hymns which were based upon the 13 principles are found in the Jewish prayer book, but they're not found as part of the actual prayer service. And that's, I think, a very instructive point. The Jewish people or the Jewish tradition never found it proper or necessary or appropriate to bring the closest thing that Judaism has to a catechism into the book which defines Judaism more than any other, namely the prayer book. Even when these hymns are sung, they're sung as a way to keep people from running out of the synagogue in a disorderly fashion. It's the very end of the service, after the actual service is over, and they're certainly not obligatory, and it's not a universal Jewish custom. But this move that he made became important in the 15th century when Judaism came under Christian attack, especially in Iberia, and the Christianity which presented itself as a religion which should be understood in terms of dogma. There were Jews who had to meet that challenge, and so they looked for a way of understanding Judaism in terms of dogma. And even more important, it was resurrected, that's perhaps not the best term, in the 19th century when Judaism was confronted by all of the challenges of the Enlightenment. When you are suddenly faced with Jews who claim to be Jewish religiously, but who have changed a lot of things that were customarily done or accepted as correct or as true, Maimonides' tool comes readily to hand. If you're arguing against nascent reform or nascent conservative Judaism, or nowadays against the full-fledged conservative reform, reconstructionist, altogether reconformadox Judaism, that was a joke, okay? If you're arguing against that from an Orthodox perspective, Orthodox itself is a new term, right? But if you're arguing against that, Maimonides is a very good tool to use. He gives you a clear-cut way of saying why these people are wrong. But the problem is, from my perspective, the tool is too effective, because it doesn't say they're wrong, it says they're heretics. And orthodoxy has backed itself into a corner, because heresy, especially after Maimonides, becomes a very serious issue. Maimonides tells us all these horrible things you're supposed to do to heretics. You can't accept them into your synagogues, you can't speak to them, you can't reply to their greetings. If a Gentile writes a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, you should put it in a closet. If a heretic writes a Torah scroll, you should burn it. And even worse, he's very, very, very hard on heretics. Now, there is no rabbi in the world who wants to treat non-Orthodox Jews as heretics. And so they're forced into all kinds of excuses, all kinds of ploys, all kinds of games. So they say non-Orthodox Jews are not heretics, they are children taken captive by heathens. That's a classic rabbinic expression. There's a wonderful rabbi in Great Britain, Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi, who wrote a book about this subject. And he was like locked into the Maimonidean framework. And he says, admittedly, this is not a tactic which non-Orthodox Jews this is a tactic of which non-Orthodox Jews might not wish to avail themselves. Can't imagine a better example of classic British understatement. Of course, it's the most condescending thing in the world. So what I'm trying to argue in this book, aside from what I hope is this really very interesting analysis of the nature of faith in Judaism, is that if you bracket the Maimonidean move and go back to classic biblical and rabbinic statements, then you have a position where you can argue against versions of Judaism with which you disagree without condemning them as heretical. I think a good example would be, this is really embarrassing, what are the two major political parties in Canada? Okay, we'll use the American example, I apologize. You know, ask me the question in Israel, 2, 12, 18? You know? A friend of mine was once running for the Knesset a long time ago, the Israeli parliament, and I liked him, and I trusted him, but I didn't want to vote for the party that he was running for, and he said, why not? We're the apotheosis of democracy, a party for each voter. In any event, in the United States, Democrats and Republicans do not agree with each other. Democrats and Republicans often hate each other's guts. Democrats and Republicans strongly object to each other. But what do they say about each other? They say that guy is wrong. They don't say that guy is a heretic, you know, in American terms. They don't read him out of the American faith, so to speak. They argue. What could be more Jewish than that? And I think if we bracket the whole Maimonidean move, then we can go back within Judaism to really good arguments. But these arguments are carried on within the fold, so to speak, and not between those who hold themselves to be within and those who hold themselves to be without. And I think this also could be a way of helping us with the kinds of problems that I stated at the beginning. I think that it's not that the authors of the Hebrew Bible and that the rabbis of the Talmud did not believe that God taught the truth to Moses at Sinai and Moses passed it on to us. There is only one truth. But knowing what that is a big, complicated issue. And part of the nature of living in the world in which we live is that we'll never really know it. So because we can never really know it, the most we can do is live our lives properly. So in other words, I think this is another reason why theology isn't native to Judaism. Because what Judaism demands of the Jew is to walk humbly with the Lord your God, not to know precisely what God is, what color God's toenails are or whatever. I don't mean to be disrespectful. None of that is relevant. What's relevant is the way in which you seek to understand what God teaches, in theological terms also, but until you get to the answer, in the meantime, you have to live a good life. And I think that kind of approach, which is, to my mind, classical Judaism, would enable Jews today to live with each other in a much greater level, much lower level of hostility. Not that I'm fooling myself to think that I will convince anybody, but that's, I'm an academic. I just get paid to write and talk and think, and so now we can end with the question with which we began. Must a Jew believe anything? Well, if you define belief as systematic theology or dogma, the answer is no. There's nothing which a Jew must believe. And that's a very non-Maimonidean reply, right? Must a Jew believe anything? If you understand belief as trust in God and seeking to live a life consistent with that trust, then yes, a Jew must believe in everything. Thank you very much. Can I just pop out and drink a water?
Yes, please. Okay.
I'm not running away. I'll be right back.
Yeah. He's just getting a bit of water, which I should have thought of. Sorry. Fascinating talk, and I think it's food for thought for all of us, Jew and Gentile alike, question of tolerance and understanding. I'm going to call your attention again to our, I think this thing's finally working, to Dr. Stefan Reif's talk on Monday the 4th of November at 7:30. The Cairo Geniza project, which Menachem Kellner mentioned, is of world importance. And I think it behooves all of us to try to attend that evening and understand the full importance of the project and for what it will mean for the University of Waterloo as well. Okay, we have some time for some questions. Who would like to begin?
Remember my threat.
Yeah. Maybe I could begin. This is a fascinating topic that you put before us, the idea that this Maimonidean parenthesis, which has dominated Jewish thought until the present day, is something which really has to be, perhaps, if we really do want to re-enter a civilized dialogue about harmony amongst Jews and beyond the Jewish world. How can that possibly, how do you turn history back? How do you begin to suggest that what has been the view that Judaism is in fact a dogmatic faith, which it really isn't, or wasn't classically, how does one begin to turn the clock back? Is it even possible, or have we gone beyond that boundary?
That's perhaps the most difficult question that could be asked about my talk.
So everything else will be easier.
Let me divide my reply into a number of points. I could be flippant and say, that's not my problem. It's like, like Werner von Braun, I just send the rockets up where they land to somebody else's in the old Tom Lehrer song. But I want to, your question is very, very important. I think that a problem facing the Jewish world is not so much will we have Jewish grandchildren, but how many Judaisms will these grandchildren confront? And I think the very fact that that's a really serious problem is perhaps the strongest argument in favor of making the kind of move I'm suggesting. Now, I realize that's not going to carry weight with all kinds of different people, but perhaps I should express it this way. If your commitment is to the continued existence of the Jewish people as some kind of unified whole, then this kind of move, or some other move similar to it, is crucial. If your commitment is to doctrinal orthodoxy, then this kind of move it's way too late, because Maimonides is classic, and he's my favorite Jewish philosopher by many standards of magnitude over anybody else. It's every other book I've ever written, he's the hero. It's the only time I've ever written where he isn't. So if you're committed to Jewish orthodoxy, that's your commitment. I think that perhaps you're too late. The only important point is that Jewish orthodoxy commits you to a concern for the future of the Jewish people and for its unity. So there may be some wiggle room there, but I'm really not optimistic about it. Sir.
If a Jew is part of an ethnic group, can a Jew be
excommunicated? Yeah. There is no such thing. Oh, yeah, the question is, can a Jew be excommunicated? Okay? In the terms in which excommunication is known in Christianity, there's no such thing in Judaism. What does excommunication mean? Well, you were a communicant and now you're not. What does it mean to be a communicant? It means you can partake of the Eucharist, right? So to be excommunicated means you are excluded from participating in the rite of the Eucharist. Now, there's nothing like that in Judaism. There's a parallel term, the Hebrew term cherem, which is usually translated excommunication, but it means something entirely different. It means social ostracism. It carries with it no narrowly defined religious penalty. It carries with it a very heavy social penalty. A person who has been, in quotes, excommunicated is a person who may not be honored in the synagogue, is a person who may not communicate, not communicant, right? May not be spoken to by other Jews. Jews are supposed to ignore their existence for a period of time. It's a social penalty, not a theological penalty. Sir.
If it is correct that there's no unifying dogma in Judaism, or hasn't historically been unifying dogma in Judaism, how do you deal with the argument that Jews are therefore defined by their behavior, and when one ceases to behave like a Jew, one ceases to be part of the mainstream of Judaism? Consequently, what's going through my mind is a question: if your theory is correct, and I'm not going to argue against it, are you not just shifting the debate? So we're no longer excluding people based on dogma,
Yeah.
we're excluding people based on their behavior.
if I can give out grades, that's not as hard a question, but it's a really good one.
Did you hear that, Simon?
Let me just say first, I want to make something very clear. I am not arguing that the Bible and rabbinic literature express orthopraxy, as if Judaism is nothing but a body of behavior. I am not making that claim. I want to be very clear on that. The beliefs, theology are matters which are assumed. They're part of the background. They're never foregrounded in classical Judaism. That's the point I want to make. But now to answer your question. The difference between the two approaches is as follows. Dogma or systematic theology is an all or nothing, in or out, saved or damned proposition. You can't be a little bit pregnant and you can't be a little bit orthodox in strict terms. Whereas you can be a little bit observant. And that's, I think, the dramatic difference. Because once the focus is on behavior, then the question is not, are you in or out, but how in are you or how out are you? Now, I'm not trying to present myself here as advocating some kind of big tent universalism. This is not the kind of pluralism is the word I'm looking for, okay? I'm trying to find a way within what I understand to be the historical confines of orthodoxy to break what I hold to be the unfortunate form of religious discourse which goes on today. So I don't want to present myself as advocating something more liberal than I'm advocating. But I hope I answered your question.
Perhaps one more question? Okay, two. Graham?
What's the difference in your mind between the argument that you're suggesting go on and an argument over what you might call what the correct dogmas are? It seems to me that within Christianity there's a lot of doctrinal dispute. You paint a picture of a lot more sharp clarity and a better way, and an easier way of telling who's in and who's out than perhaps is the case. And a lot of the argument is not so much who's in and who's out, but on what's the correct way to formulate the doctrine of this or the doctrine of that. And I wonder whether you're really arguing for an argument about how to formulate or rethink, say, Maimonides' principles rather than moving away from them entirely.
Okay, before I answer that, I want to make another prefatory comment, then I'll try to answer your very important question. Martin Buber wrote a book once called Two Types of Faith. In that book, he makes, to my mind, is an over-exaggerated and perhaps simple-minded claim. He says Christianity is a religion of belief that, and Judaism is a religion of belief in. I think that's much too simple. I think that there is no Christian denomination which simply wants its adherents to agree to the statements of whatever catechism they hold and doesn't really care how they relate to God or how they relate to others or whether they're trustworthy in their relationships to God at all. In other words, as much as I think Christianity emphasizes doctrine, it certainly is also interested in this other aspect of belief. Similarly, I think as much as classical Judaism is interested in the believer as trusting in God and behaving in a trustworthy fashion, it's not entirely, as I've tried to indicate, uninterested in theology. So I'm talking here in terms of emphases, not in terms of hard and fast. Now to get back to your point, I still think there's a real difference. Lutherans can argue about how to understand this doctrine or that doctrine, and for all I know, there are 35 versions of Lutheranism, just like there are 35 versions of every version of Judaism. I just don't know. But surely Lutherans will distinguish themselves from Greek Orthodox on very important doctrinal issues. In other words, as much as there may be arguments within denominations or between close denominations on how to formulate or understand particular doctrines, there surely is an emphasis on the doctrine when the denomination comes to distinguish itself from others. And I'm trying to argue that entire form of discourse is foreign to Judaism. Let me add a word about this, if I may. Can I? Okay, this is like I'm sneaking in another lecture. I think part of what's going on here, and I can't prove this, but I have a sense. That's part of what's going on here, and I didn't talk about it at all, is the notion of original sin. That if you hold that human beings are, in some significant sense, distanced from God metaphysically, theologically, ontologically at birth, then there's literally nothing a person can do to overcome that. So God has to save you. So doing things is not going to work. But what you can do is prepare yourself to accept God's salvation, and that involves, among other things, certain doctrinal claims, as I understand it. If your vision of humanity is not one which involves original sin, that means that you can, in effect, do it. I saw a bumper sticker at the University of Rochester last week, which sort of like summarizes the whole thing. The bumper sticker said, "As a Christian, I'm not perfect, only forgiven." Now, what is that bumper sticker saying? Saying, I didn't perfect myself. I'm not claiming to be better than you, but I'm claiming to be different because God forgave me my tainted nature. A Jewish bumper sticker would have to be something else. The Jewish bumper sticker would have to be, did you do a good deed today? Not that Christians don't do good deeds, God forbid, but there's no gulf or taint to be overcome, so that the focus on behavior becomes that much more important in Judaism because that's what really counts. Let me put it to you like this. If you're born more or less with a clean slate, as Judaism seems to teach, now, most of us mess up that slate. That's the nature of human beings. We're fallible. The Jewish claim is that you can clean the slate. That's tshuva, or repentance. Repentance is obviously an important issue in Christianity as well, but from a different context. As long as what ultimately counts is what your slate looks like at the end of your life, then the emphasis is going to be on what you do on that slate. So I think that's another way of understanding what's going on here. The emphasis on behavior in Judaism, it seems to me, to reflect a vision which does not include original sin. The emphasis on doctrine in Christianity seems to me to reflect an emphasis which does include it. But there's no real logical connection here. This makes sense to me psychologically. I don't make the claim that there's a real logical entailment between these two issues.
Okay, I think we'll wind it up there. And Dr. Kellner will stay around for a few minutes to entertain other individuals' personal questions. And I would like now to call on Dr. Jim Walker of our Department of History to thank our speaker.
It's pretty formal.
Please.
Well, I've been an anticlimax before. Tonight's not the first time. I'm accused by Susan King, our Secretary for Jewish Studies, who says I always get up and make another speech, so I won't tonight. But I was chatting with a colleague of mine this afternoon who was regretting that he couldn't come tonight because he's teaching a class. Stan Johannesson, if anybody wants to check my footnote. And Stan went and got a volume and read to me a quote from Leon Blum, which I'm sure you know, Paul. And Leon Blum, the French Jewish politician, was asked, what is a Jew? And he said, this was 70 years ago, so it was gender specific. He said, a Jew is an ordinary Frenchman who, instead of not going to church, does not go to the synagogue. I didn't know whether I could use that tonight or not, because I hadn't met Professor Kellner until dinner, and I didn't know this talk was going to be as entertaining as it was thoughtful. We did have a good dinner, didn't we? Although why Michael Higgins gets the credit, I don't know. He neither cooked it nor paid for it, for heaven's sake. But it was a very good dinner. We had an enjoyable time, and I think we all felt we got to know our guest speaker in that intimate couple of hours. But then the rest of us, and it is, as Jim Diamond mentioned, it's an overwhelmingly positive audience tonight in terms of size and response. The rest of us have been treated to a really terrific intellectual feast. I think it was an almost flawless performance. Let me point out the one flaw, sir. It's Bathurst Street, not Bathurst Avenue. Apart from that, I don't think I can find a single fault with the lecture we heard tonight. Not just the content, which was, of course, extremely interesting and provocative, but the delivery, which was so engaging. I thank you very much for being here tonight.